I'd been writing about, my research began because I'd been writing about ethnic and black and migratory history in the Adirondack region since 1988 or so. And the director of John Brown Lives, a social action group in Westport, heard of the story of Timbuctoo and thought it would be thrilling to develop an exhibition about it, even while she knew nothing about it, and I didn't either. But she approached me and said, sounds like you'd be a good person to curate this. And after some back and forthing, I agreed. And what was supposed to be a one-off, a year or so of research, has turned into a huge project. But that's how I got started. It was to develop the exhibition, Dreaming of Timbuctoo. And what made that exciting for me was it was the first time I was aware of that the story of the black settlers in the Adirondacks who came here because of what Gerrit Smith did was approached in terms of their own experience and their own interest and their own rejection of the voting rights law and hope to gain rights for themselves, not through the window of John Brown's interest. So I wasn't coming to it through John Brown, and they weren't the side story or the sideshow to his epic story. They were their own story in their own right, and that really compelled me, putting them, recentering the stories so they were at the heart of it. And that's where I think the exhibition breaks new ground. The biggest challenge is the complete absence of documentation of their own experience, because so many of them were not literate, did not have the time or the means to record their experience, because poor people mostly don't, and because white people around here weren't that interested, and when they did, it suited the greater narrative at the time to picture them as refugees from the underground, or people engaged, fugitives on the Underground Railroad who were brought here by white helpers and not at their own initiative. And this is a long-standing trope in American history, but it isn't actually the story here. Some people came here because they were fugitives. Most didn't. They were free New Yorkers when they got land. And fighting that old myth has been a challenge and a thrill as well. Well, the myth of Timbuctoo that you'll find survives generations of Adirondack history from really the 1870s, even earlier until the 1950s, is that it was made up of refugees from slavery who were brought here by white helpers and redeemers to settle on this land, and Gerrit Smith was only interested in this land for fugitive slaves. That isn't the case. He was interested in helping poor black New Yorkers in the cities of New York, some of whom may have been born into slavery and escaped it, but at the time they came here, they were free citizens of New York. There are exceptions to this, but overwhelmingly this was for voting rights to fight slavery, voting rights for free black New Yorkers in the North. The pendulum now has swung the other way, and people learning about and writing about and researching this story understand that its recipients were free black New Yorkers. But the myth has been a hard one to fight because it's so full of romance and rescue and white people to the rescue. And that's a very charismatic myth even now, which has to be challenged when we can. This is a great question. And they were chosen. They were scrupulously vetted by Gerrit Smith's team of agents who were mostly black, some white, and who were told to pick men, good men, only men could get the votes, so it was only given to men, between 20 and 60 or so, in good health, who were demonstrably poor and who didn't drink. That was very important to Gerrit Smith. He was a temperance man, and to all of his agents too. So most of these men were ministers or had strong positions at black newspapers, who had some kind of audience in the cities where they lived, through their churches, through their papers, through their pulpits. And at these places, they advertised and promoted Gerrit Smith's giveaway and invited people to sign up and come to them, and they would vet them. And they did this pretty scrupulously. Several of them would write to Gerrit Smith and say, please take a deed away from this guy, he's a drunk. Please don't give this guy land who I suggested, he's a blockhead, or whatever. But they did not just hand them out without considering who their beneficiaries were. They wanted their choices to reflect well on them as well. Did Gerrit Smith face resistance? That's a really interesting question. I think he faced some resentment because of his strictures about drinking. Not everybody was on board with his own temperance ideology, and some people felt it was punitive and uncomprehending, and he wasn't in a position to judge people as drunks because they drank a beer on a weekend when they could. And so some objected to it on that account, or the agents feared as much. Some people suspected black political activists that he was trying to buy votes with these land gifts and trying to buy votes for his political party, the Liberty Party. But there's no evidence at all anywhere that I've ever found that he said, I will only give you land if you vote my way or the highway. There's nothing that indicates it was a quid pro quo in that respect. It was his hope, but he never put it in paper. It wasn't a condition of the gift. The only conditions were the things I mentioned to you. Sobriety, reasonable good health, and poverty, and good character. Integration in the community was pretty full. I just returned from a trip to the Deep South, and it was radically, criminally full compared to what was happening in the South. In the second half of the 19th century, schools were integrated, churches were integrated, workplaces were integrated, work crews were sometimes integrated, homes were integrated to the extent that some black families had white workers working in their home and some white families had black hired people working in their homes or helpers. Social integration is another story, and political integration was unheard of. You don't see black descendants of the grantees or the grantees gaining any places politically. Very nominal first level positions like overseer of the roads, overseer of the fences. Yes, Lyman Epps was an overseer of roads, for instance, for the fledgling North Elba. But he never could have been the mayor. That would not have happened. Nobody would serve on a jury who was a person of color. Nobody would be the school superintendent in this county that I can think of, and so forth. That didn't happen. The value of this for Adirondack locals is that it claims it as part of their history. If you mean white people, since the Adirondacks is overwhelmingly white, it suggests this was an integrated history from the first days of the frontier, and the idea that it was ever a white space for white people where blackness was foreign is not documentable. It's not true. And so that challenges some very common tacit myths about Adirondack social culture, and I think that's thrilling and exciting.